Well, hello everyone. It's John Laughland. I'm the Director of Forum for Democracy International. My co-host Peter Lavelle and I are delighted to welcome as our main guest Ulrike Guérot, who joins us from Berlin, and George Samueli from Budapest. Ulrike Guérot is a political scientist, a former professor of European politics at the University of Bonn, former member of the German Marshall Fund and of the European Council of Foreign Relations, the author of very numerous books, a graduate of the one of the schools where I used to teach, Sciences Po in Paris. She is also, if you don't mind me saying so, Ulrike, emblematic of our time. You've written about our times. Your latest book is called Zeitenwenden, Times of Change, but your own career, your own experience, and particularly in recent years, is emblematic of our times. Would you like to tell us, Ulrike, about your latest books and about your own experience and why, if you agree, why there is a new authoritarianism in Europe? Ulrike.
Thank you, John, for having me here. Thank you, George, and thank you for being here, Peter. Happy to discuss this with you. Zeitenwenden is a book that I wrote just in May. It's out for 6 weeks, and what I just wanted to do is to capture the time, the time which is definitely changing. Everybody can sense this, can smell it, that we are preparing for war. I mean, this is the narrative as it goes, which is basically also the perversion of the EU, which once upon a time started as a peace project. We were told for 70 years Europe means no longer war. Now the EU tries to define itself as the unity that needs to defend liberty against Russia. So it's a perversion of their own narrative, yeah. And I try to capture this momentum of the perversion or change of a narrative into something new as a Zeitenwende, change of time. And I basically make the point that we are now finishing what you call a historical era, you know?
Yes.
I mean, we look back into history, we all used to say it's 1872 to 1918, or it's 1918 to 1933, whatever. We know where the epoch eras in the past have been, when they were opening and when they were closing. And what I do in my book is basically saying that the last system that we built in 1945 or 49, you know, is now closing, so that we are finishing an era of, say, 80 years, something between 1945 and 2025. And so we have 80 years that we are, you know, pushing back, and something new begins. And we do not know yet where this new will bring us. The game is open. We don't have any, you know, finishing on the story of Russia, Ukraine. We don't know what will happen to Iran, Gaza, and the whole thing. But what we see is that there is an international system which is falling apart. The system that is falling apart is the Pax Americana. We had Trump elected, we had MAGA, we had the ambition of Donald Trump to retire, I mean, to finish financial overstretch, military overstretch. Now we see him backpedaling with Iran on the one hand, and also on Russia now very recently. So it's again a time change. But at least in the past months, we could have hoped for that, and that is what I wrote in my book Zeitenwende, that Donald Trump wanted to end Pax Americana and wanted to engage the USA in BRICS, you know, multipolar world, and that his aim was to position the USA in that multipolar world, and that had several components. Now we need to see, because again, he's backpedaling on MAGA himself, he is in difficulties, and now it's again shaky, but that was the thing. And what I discuss in my book is what is in there for Europe, because for 30 years, basically since 92, the Maastricht Treaty, when times were different, when we had people like Kohl or Mitterrand or Delors, who in a different era of time built different things and wanted a political union, wanted a democratic and social political union called Europe. When we wanted to build the common house with Gorbachev, I mean, we had two projects. The one was the political union, Maastricht Treaty 92. The other was the OSCE, Charter of Paris in 91, which was the peace architecture with Russia. So essentially Europe, that's my argument, in the 90s, in the early 90s, wanted to have a politically united continent with Russia. And this aim has completely going down the river. Yeah. And then we try to sort of do the story. When did this happen? Obviously, there are many steps, but the argument is that in the 90s, at least there was still hope. I mean, I worked for Jacques Delors in Paris. I can, Orban once upon a time was the little cherry child of Helmut Kohl, I mean, Orban was not always the bad guy. It's very interesting to look back at these times, and Hungary,
Yes.
the flourishing country, the best pupil in Europe, and that's way back. But what I want to say in my Change of Time book is that this is now all gone, and Europe is in deep trouble because we failed on political integration, we failed on social Europe, we failed on the constitution, and we have been more or less, call it, hijacked by the US or by a geostrategic agenda of the United States. Now the narrative goes that we need to direct Europe in a war against Russia. I feel like this is detrimental, if not suicidal, for Europe. We should go back to the old goals. The old goals, let's call, Kreisky or Olaf Palme or Egon Bahr or Willy Brandt. Let's remember the goal of a peace architecture with Russia. And so I claim for abandoning the sanctions, rebuilding the pipelines, doing a European Russian youth institution like we did with France in 1963 with de Gaulle and Adenauer, to cultivate exchange among the next, young generations in a European Russian setting. So Zeitenwende, times of change, because I feel like it's time that we need to structure the Europe we want to live in. And structuring the Europe we want to live in means two things. It means essentially thinking Europe beyond the EU. I think everybody comes to grips with the fact that the technostructure of the European Union is no longer working, and it has been totally perverted in the past, say, since the banking crisis at the latest, probably a little bit before, but since the banking crisis, it's evident that there was austerity, cleavages, whatever. I mean, whatever are the reasons, we told it was only the lazy Greeks, but it was much more complicated than this. Anyway, then came the refugee crisis. Europe is unreformable, I think, can't be reformed. There's no political will to reform. But even worse, there is not even a scenario or a common sort of idea towards we shift the European project. Because I stand here, I feel like we need Europe. We need Europe as an entity in the multipolar world. We need to conceptualize this entity in institutional terms, in social terms, in democratic terms, in geostrategic terms. I think nobody has a clear clue of an idea what should be the Europe beyond the EU. And I think that's the intellectual task of the times of change. And for this idea in my book, and that's my last sentence, I sketch out three things. Actually, I will send this map also to you. But I work with a very old map of Europe in this in my book. I'm trying to find this card here. Because the oldest card of Europe is from 1534. And the map of Europe, I will send it to you so you can show it in the show. This is Europe as a women. And this women, you need to imagine that Iberia, so Portugal, Spain, is the head. And then France is the breast, and the heart is Germany. And then the left arm is the UK. The other arm is towards Italy. And then she has a huge dress. And the dress ends behind Moscow and behind Istanbul. And I take this map to argue three things. Europe looks to the Orient because the way she's placed, she looks to the Orient. She doesn't look Washington, because if she were to look Washington, she would need to really torture her neck, right? Yeah. So first thing, Europe can't be in the sort of transatlantic West. The West is basically empty. The West has no culture. The West is a NATO defense institution with now no cultural grounding basement. So my argument, and perhaps now you can place the card which I sent you. There is this. There's one card I sent to the organizer.
Can we see the map, Brent? Maybe he's.
Anyway, I continue.
Well, in lieu of the image coming up, but haven't you answered your own question? What is beyond the EU for Europe? We already have it. It's NATO. Okay.
Well, I mean that is,
and that's the problem, because that's the only thing that's going to keep it together. That's why they need Russia as a threat. They need China as a threat. How they're going to deal with the United States with this president is very unclear. But we do know the answer, and that answer is tragic, because I don't know how you go beyond that.
Look, I mean, in my book, I have a couple of maps, and this is the one where I argue that basically, if we want to really think about the future of Europe, Europe beyond the EU, the red line, which is here and which is a clear-cut line through the European continent from the Baltics down to Turkey, the red line needs to be placed in the Atlantic. Not because I'm anti-American, I'm not. I'm just like, make the Americans do their things and we in Europe, we do our things, right? I mean, there is this transatlantic, it's interesting because these are the countries which are in the so-called rule-based order. We know that the rule-based order has been more or less invented to circumvent the UN Carta, and it's interesting that you see here Argentina in, and then you remember that Donald Trump at some point said Canada should become a state of the United States of the USA. So what I argue in my book, because I found articles of Richard Rosenkranz, who's a US professor for political science, and in the beginning of the last decade, there were some interesting thoughts in the US in political science, which basically were saying, because of the rise of China, there should be something like a merger of the US and the EU, and they called it USA-EU. And this is more or less the red line if you add Canada or Greenland, which was what Trump was saying. So the question I ask in my book with this card is, does Europe want to stay there within this red line, or does Europe to want to go for an emancipatory strategy? We place the red line in the Atlantic. Europe looks to the Orient, and we find some, understanding like it always were in European history since Homer and the Iliad. It's the Occident-Orient sort of mirroring that has been also culturally very enriching. But on the other hand, the Europe stands on the feet of Russia. I found this, don't know whether you can see this here. I hold it.
That is this. Yes, I know that map. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So this is the oldest map of Europe. You see this, the head. And look, I mean, the three things I take out of that map is that she, Mrs. Europe, looks to the Orient. She doesn't turn her head to Washington. She stands with her feet on Russian soil, on Eurasian soil, and in her hand that goes to the Orient, I mean, the hand which is today's Italy, basically she holds what you call der Reichsappel, Res Publica Christiana. So there is an allusion to the Republic. And this is basically an anti-capitalist concept, because res publica is common good, is an institutional order which is good for the people. And I take these three elements, standing on Russian soil, looking to the Orient, and having den Reichsapfel, which is Caesar Papismus, which is the Res Publica Christiana, which has been turned into Res Publica Europea, which is the common good for Europe, which is a different social historical concept than venture capitalism like in the USA. So I make a very strong cultural argument and a very strong social argument, and also a very strong, argument of historical economic traditions, that Europe is distinctively different in its culture, also in its economic culture, than the United States of America, which are more or less sovereign capital, Wall Street, and so on and so forth, which has oligarchic tendencies, which Europe does not have, because Europe from the Middle Ages is much about la città, the citizen, le citoyen, la République, Jean Baudin, les 6 livres de la République, la Révolution, about poorness, about poverty, like Franz von Assisi, the Catholic Church. So we are not sovereign capital. So there's a very distinct economic order on the European continent in its tradition. And so in my book, I try to bring back all these civilizatory aspects to say, if Europe wants to have a future in the 21st century, if Europe as a cultural and political unity wants to emerge in the multipolar world, it needs to disentangle from the United States, especially on 3 building blocks: to disentangle NATO and the West, to disentangle from GAFA complex, because all this digital stuff is also, we are connected to the US, and thirdly, to disentangle from, this Wall Street, Frankfurt, London, New York. Yeah. So looking to the Orient, standing on Eurasian feet and thinking about the Republic, am I three? I mean, it's an esquisse, it's an ideas book, but I find like these are three orientations where Europe needs to turn around. And the moment it would do it intellectually, it would have perhaps a leeway to come to a very different institutional order than the order we have, which is some nation states build the European Union, which is simply no longer working.
Yeah. I must admit, I have a slightly different reading of the recent history from you, Ulrike. You talked about the 90s and Kohl and Mitterrand, and then you referred back to Egon Bahr and these great figures. There may have been a respite in the 1990s, but it didn't last very long because, as we all know, that decade ended with the not only with NATO enlargement, but more importantly with the NATO attack on Yugoslavia. And the reason I mention that is that for me, when we go back to the origins of the European Union, the first European community back in 1950, which, by the way, sidelined the by then already existing Council of Europe, we can see the hand of the Americans very clearly in those early years. And more importantly, the hand of the Americans within the context of the nascent Cold War. The creation of the first European communities was an act of, it was not a hostile act, but it was part of the division of Europe. Germany was divided in, as you well know, in May 1949, and then, within a year, the coal and steel community had been created. And this was very much a Cold War project because the Americans and the other Western powers feared quite simply that with the Red Army in Berlin, that Western Europe was vulnerable. And that Cold War music almost, I would say, never went away because obviously the Cold War itself lasted, as we all know, until the end of the 1980s. And then, yes, you had a bit of euphoria with Gorbachev, but he didn't last long. And then we were back, if you like, on pattern. The Russians under Yeltsin were already in 1996 saying they didn't want NATO enlargement, but of course it went ahead. In other words, I see what would you say to those who say that the current situation with Russia is nothing but the continuation of something that has been going on really almost for the 80 years that you're describing?
First, I totally agree with the analysis, and just to, but that's the book before my last book, Endgame Europe, from 2022.
Yeah.
But that is with Hauke Ritz, my co-author, where we describe exactly that process, that this sort of, post-war, Cold War, US bloc confrontation, whatever, then comes 89, and then also, we say that the today's Ukraine, whatever conflict, is the apotheose of basically what has been a leeway since basically decades. Reaching out into the Russian sphere and so on and so forth. Brzezinski, Grand Chessbook, and so. The only, coming back to what I said earlier, the only difference I'd make is that I think we had a window, a very small window of history, which was the 89 to Yugoslavia war, 96, these 7 years, with de Gaulle, with Yeltsin, with Kohl, with Mitterrand, who died in 95, where I do think that the French socialists, don't forget it was Mitterrand socialist, it was González, who were all sort of pro-Russian, you would say, but more or less anti-American. I mean, there was always a strong anti-American tendency in European socialism, right? So the moment we had the opening, Europe whole and free, 89 and so on and so forth, with Yeltsin, with Kohl, with Mitterrand, with Delors, building the European Union, Euro, blah, blah, blah. At that window of opportunity or time window, I think Europe, you had honest people, let's say honest people who tried hard to do that emancipatory sort of work for Europe, right? I agree with you that it has been since ever then undermined, torpedoed. Brzezinski's book is from 96, I think, the Grand Chess
Yes.
book. Then came the neocons, 2000, and then this all, democracy promotion, NATO enlargement, which is a parallel agenda, democracy promotion in the Middle East and NATO enlargement were two outreaching agendas of the United States, one for the Occident, the other for the Orient. We also need to look at this in cinch. But I do agree that coming to the European Constitution, and I could tell very many details about this, about the process of EU enlargement, how the Americans tried to torpedo the euro, there were clear interference from Washington the moment when the European project, for a second of history, could have materialized, could have been good. Let's remember that Putin was in the Bundestag in 2001 and got standing ovation by the German Bundestag. 2002, we do the euro, although the Americans did everything to torpedo the euro as a competition currency to the dollar. Then we do the Constitution 2003, which later then is, dropped against, and we do enlargement. So for a moment of time, you could see, with a little bit of, hope and emergence, you see a European project emerging. Europe gets larger, Europe gets a currency, Europe gets a constitution, and Europe is in peace with Putin in 2001, all in the years 2001 to 3, 4, 5. And we see since the war of Yugoslavia, then in the coming years with how also the war in Iraq impacted on the European constitutional making. Remember Europe, good Europe, old Europe, how Europe was split on the Iraq war. You see, and we argue this in Endgame, you see one American interference after the other. Oh. And I think in the reading back these years, we need to read that the Americans were disturbed by seeing a European emancipatory project.
But to be fair here, I mean, I don't, you're looking, it seems to me that Europe is a victim of America. There were a lot of people that went along with this here, a lot of people that sold out Europe. And they won. Okay, they won.
Yeah. Peter, okay. I mean, it is divide et impera. It was always so. Every European country, or the elites of many European countries, feel like their best bet is to be the best friends of the US. I mean, starting with the Germans, but then the Brits, and then the Dutch, and then the Danes, and everybody feels like I'm the best friend of the US, blah, blah, blah. Now it's Estonia or the Poles today. So yes, I mean, there is a lot there are articles and articles about this divide et impera thing. But at the end of the story, what we need to address here and now is we are now in 2025. If you want, so the American divide et impera agenda has taken over. Europe is in really bad shape. And once again, Europe needs to confront the question,
you bring
does it have to be in the red line, or do we want to go emancipation?
You bring up the Yugoslav conflict, and I'd like George's thoughts on this here. I mean, because that seems like kind of a vector where things could have gone. George, I mean, why didn't Europe take care of a European problem?
Well, that's the point, that it really wasn't the Americans. I mean, the Yugoslav problem was launched by Germany. It was Germany. The first act that he did on point of unification, October the 3rd, 1990, when Helmut Kohl announced to the world, henceforth, only peace will emanate from German soil. Within a few months, Germany went ahead. And incidentally, the United States did not support this. This is Germany went ahead and recognized the independence of Croatia and Slovenia. This was an act of extreme aggression, and obviously done with a view to eliminating once and for all any Russian influence in Europe. The Americans really only came into it at a much later stage because they were shocked by the speed with which Germany had moved. And then they jointly went ahead and just destroyed Yugoslavia. Throughout those years, the glorious 90s, the NATO was already on enlargement. The enlargement of NATO began 1992. This process was a steady process. They started the Partnership for Peace program, deceived by saying, "Oh, this isn't the path to NATO." Everyone knew, of course, the Russians knew perfectly well that's a pathway to NATO. So this is step by step. They were doing everything they could in order to push Russia out of Europe. Now, you mentioned the Gorbachev. The only reason they were friendly with Gorbachev. The only reason is they were afraid they would lose Gorbachev. They thought Gorbachev was such a dope, such a useless, ineffectual leader that sooner or later he will be overthrown by the hardliners. They were constantly afraid of the hardliners who would come to power in Moscow. So they did everything they could to strengthen Gorbachev. You know, they would go in there and say, oh, you know, we really like Gorbachev. When George H.W. Bush, the elder Bush, he went to Kiev and say, oh, we don't want any suicidal nationalism here. Not because he didn't want Ukraine to secede, but they were afraid throughout that Gorbachev will not survive. Eventually, Gorbachev didn't survive. So my point is only that there really was never this great time. That moment, as I say, with Gorbachev was only because they were afraid that he wouldn't survive, and he didn't. And even just going back to the days of Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr, why did they act the way they acted? Well, because there was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was seen to be powerful, and intelligent Western leaders said, hey, if we want to achieve anything, we need to cultivate good relations with the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union was ceased to be powerful and was perceived no longer to be powerful, in particular Russia was no longer to be powerful, then there was no incentive to be nice to Russia or the Soviet Union, because I said, well, what's the point of that? So that's why I just think that it's not because Egon Bahr or Willy Brandt had some very idealistic goals. Remember, Willy Brandt was a Cold War figure way back when he was the mayor of West Berlin, but he realized that the Soviet Union is a very powerful place, and he had to adapt his policies to recognize it and then see what Germany can get out of cultivating good relations with the Kremlin.
You want me to react?
Yeah, I mean, just to reply.
I obviously know about the Croatia thing, and then Slovenia, and then this sort of German decision, unilateral decision, yeah. And I remember that Jacques Delors was very, very sad or upset or in anger, yeah, because it was a unilateral decision. And there's also, what was the position of the Vatican in all this, and so on and so forth, yeah. So obviously there was something going wrong with this accession thing, and why Croatia sneaked in very early, and Slovenia and Serbia was left out, and so on and so forth. So
Germany pushed this. Germany pushed this. This wasn't Croatia and Slovenia. Germany was pushing right from the start. From 1990 on, Germany was encouraging independence within Croatia and Slovenia.
Yeah,
this wasn't just, oh, hey, look what Croatia and Slovenia. Croatia and Slovenia would not have dared to make their move without the full support of Germany.
Okay, but then we need to know who pushed the Germans to do so, yeah, because there's no sort of basic interest in German-Croatian relations, yeah. But I agree with you that there was a very strategic.
There isn't. I kind of thought that there was a long-standing relationship between Germany and Croatia, going back to World War II, going back to Austria-Hungary and World War I. So
I'm not in denial.
Yeah, animus towards the Serbs and a long-standing friendship with Croatia.
Yeah. I'm not in denial that there were really forces behind it. If not, it would not have happened. Yeah. Still, I would argue that in the Franco-German dynamic. I mean, I know also Mitterrand going to Sarajevo I think he flew over for a day or so to Sarajevo in 95. We all saw the Dayton Agreement. We all saw that the European Union was dramatically failing. Yeah. I mean, there's no point about it when all this Amselfeld sort of conflict would arise, and Europe would basically see that everything that we discussed in the Maastricht Treaty, that we would have a common defense and so on and so forth, would fall apart. Yeah, so Europe was shown into the face the powerlessness. Yeah, but still, I would argue that until say 98, that's why I think we agree in the analysis. I do not want to dispute this analysis. I'm just thinking, and perhaps I'm too idealistic. I can easily admit I'm too idealistic. Yeah. But at least my sentiment in the early 90s was that the Franco-German dynamic was sort of still in place, that there were ambitions to build a powerful Europe. You can also remember Saint-Malo, 98, that the Brits wanted to join the European defense union. Even Tony Blair in 2000, he wanted to join the Euro. Most people don't know, yeah, but CBI had a huge campaign about the UK joining the Euro. So there was also a strategic element about an emancipatory sort of political union that some people people at least saw emerging in the 90s. And in the 90s, I would still argue there was a small window of history that it could have had emerged. But I agree with you, there were different and other tendencies that went against, and very early went against. And obviously the Yugoslavia sort of thing was the biggest, debacle. And it impacted, you are right, also on German politics. I mean, it were the Greens, it was Joschka Fischer who voted for the AVEX, which was out of area. I mean, we changed the constitution for it. There was immense pressure on Germany to do these things. So there was a real change also within German politics to go from Bundeswehr to Bundeswehr out of area, to change on the AVEX and so on and so forth. And it was basically changing the Greens. And we see from the Greens, who became a power with a pacifist approach with Petra Kelly in 83, that now 30 years later with Annalena Baerbock and Habeck, they are basically a warmongering party. So, and all this happened with Fischer and Madeleine Albright on the Yugoslavia conflict. I agree with you. The little sort of footnote, at least I'd like to dream, is that we had a little moment of thinking about Europe post-89, which would go into emancipation. The only thing I say, even if your analysis or our analysis is just right, for me, the top question for today is it over? Is any dream of an emancipatory Europe that goes with Russia, looks to the Orient, disentangles its relation with all these, Orient countries, BRICS countries, is the question that Europe could go BRICS, to make it very, blunt, and disentangle out of the NATO West sort of context? Because there is now momentum for, even in the US, you have an anti-NATO movement. So we need to think about what the West is. I mean, I know that the forces on current policies are against. I know that even, for instance, the AfD in Germany, which started to be an anti-NATO party, or Marine Le Pen, which started to be an anti-NATO party, is now increasingly shifting towards Atlantic positions. Yeah, we see that all the populist parties in Europe who 10 years ago would say, let's go with Russia, now are turning back to an Atlantic shift. Yeah, so I can see this. I'm still posing the question, where does Europe wants to go? And the question is twofold. Do we have an ambition that there's something like Europe in the 21st century? If so, how would it look like? How do we organize it, institutionalize it? Does this European entity wants to be independent, emancipated? Or does it want to hang around in a NATO Western GAFA complex like in the map I showed?
But the topic of our program is Europe's new authoritarianism. How do you deal with that? Okay, because all these other issues are, I'm sorry, kind of footnotes. Okay, because if this new authoritarianism, which has been given such a nice liberal veneer to it, okay, we're trying to save democracy, we're trying to save freedom of speech and all this. I mean, what is the counterbalance to that? Because I just see it getting worse and worse and worse. I have no intention of visiting a Western capital anytime soon, maybe never again, considering the trends that I see going on right now. So, I mean, we're talking about new authoritarianism. What are the institutions? I mean, what is the cultural paradigm we need to pursue? Because this is very, very potent, and the pushback to it, I don't see the tools. And you know what? I'm sorry, I don't see the will.
If you don't want to visit any European capital, I've been told that Budapest is quite nice these days. So I just wanted to come over to Budapest for next time soon. Look, Peter, you are absolutely right. So we are dealing with an institution that is getting ever more authoritarian, let's face it. We have the list of sanctions. There's Annalena Lipp, Tom Röpers. We have German citizens which are incriminated for having critical blogs. They can't join their own country, although they have a German passport. So we are, even without any court has seen the cases, by directives, they have been put on a sanctions list. This is unbearable. We see policies towards, weapons delivery and warmongering of the European Union. Von der Leyen recently spoke about their vollumfängliche Krieg. So I don't know what is in English, but she told about this encompassing war towards Ukraine. There is weapons delivery towards Israel, which are not suspended, although we know there is genocide taking place in Gaza. So there's unbearable policies. The European Union is not in compliance with any standards of international law. It's a tragedy. For me, it's a tragedy. Yeah, as a European, it's a tragedy. So I think what we are all trying to deal with, and nobody sees really how to deal with it, is the discrepancy that I'm still convinced that many citizens on the European continent, say the 500 million European citizens, they have a sort of resonance that there's something of Europe and they want to be united in some form. But most of them know not the EU, not that EU, not the European Digital Service Act, not the Green Agenda, not the electronic euro, whatever are the things. Yeah, we want to keep the currency, I mean, the liquid currency. Nobody wants to go entirely digital. The Digital Service Act is really sort of real now with Meta going on Facebook. I give you a very precise example. I posted some horrible pictures of Gaza, writing, see what is happening in Gaza. And then I was alerted by Facebook that they shadow banned my posting, yeah, because I would place horrible pictures. So I wasn't placing horror. I would just point to horrors taking place, yeah. So we see all these very subtle mechanisms.
You're the horrible person, not what's going on in Gaza.
Yeah. So we see that with the algorithms, there's a subtle sort of, the way it's framed. Everybody knows this. Everybody who's a critical voice. I mean, I have been banned and shadow banned and canceled and even fired from my university. So I know many Germans now who have bank accounts which are closed. So it's hard and becoming really harder to be a critical voice. And the mechanisms are subtle. So you don't see the brutality. And if you talk to your friends, you say, look, I mean, there is censorship in Germany. Everybody said, no. And look, I mean, there are bank accounts which are canceled and so on and so forth. So the problem is that the mechanisms of dominance are subtle, that they are not visible, that it's hard to argue that it's because of your opinion. It's just like my bank account has been closed and that is in regulatory terms totally okay. Yeah, the bank is not obliged to give you an account and so on and so forth. So yes, I'm very, very alerted. I'm also alerted that say larger majorities do not even know what we are talking about, because larger pluralities of people still think that it's all fine. Unfortunately, in my opinion, most of these pluralities, at least in Germany, are totally in the NATO narrative, defend liberal Europe against Russia, and Putin is Hitler and the whole thing. So yes, this shows how powerful is the impact of NATO-controlled sort of press agencies and journals in Europe. Yeah, so everybody knows the critical journals in the Netherlands, in France, and so on and so forth. So, Peter, my point is not to deny that there is this authoritarian sort of tendency in the EU. The intelligent question is, how can we, because what I do think is, if we want Europe in the 21st century, I mean, we can renounce on Europe. We can say that it's America and the Chinese are eating into Europe and they are building the trains from Belgrade to Budapest, then fine, okay, and the rest is the US taking over GAFA. Okay, fine. I mean, who needs Europe? The first question is, do we want to be Europe? If we answer yes, there is something like Europe and we have an idea, although we cannot spell it out, but there's something like a cultural resonance. We want to be Europe. Then we need to think about a political form that gives us an order for that European continent. If so, we would have a huge intellectual work to make. How do we constitute that continent? How social is the continent? What's the geographic outreach, and so on and so forth? Huge intellectual work, yeah. And
could I just ask, like, what do you mean by Europe? What is this Europe? You've mentioned this several times. This Europe, I mean, as far as I can see, this Europe is ramming down every country's throat LGBTQ rights, so much so that they threatened Hungary. This became a big issue for the European Union to go to Budapest, ram down the throats of Hungarians, a massive LGBTQ parade, which obviously Hungarians don't particularly want. Certain Hungarians do want it, but it's a tiny minority. But that's it's that tiny minority that the EU embraces. We've now had the same thing in Moldova, which is an EU aspirant state. They're ramming down Moldovans' throats LGBTQ. I mean, anybody who's opposed to holding an LGBTQ parade should be punished, should be imprisoned. So I'm just wondering, like, what are these values of the EU? Because it sounds like, you can list it, LGBTQ, or as it, euthanasia, abortion, the contemporary social and cultural fad. That's what the EU today.
Yeah, and George, you can expand it. You can expand it too.
Okay.
About the Romanian election. I mean, we can go into what democratic values are. I mean, even if people speak up using a legitimate or consensus process called an election, okay, and then Brussels turns around and says, nope, we don't like the results, okay? I mean, how do you fight against that?
Okay, I take your point. I'm also against this.
We want you to be right. We want you to be right. We're on your side.
Okay, posing the right question is not necessarily having the answer. I think we do agree that we are against this, what is called postmodernist woke agenda, which is a very wrong understanding of what values are, which is the perversion of original values and so on and so forth. I think we do agree. What I want to do is to lift the discussion. And I know it's difficult because there is the current political process and you point to LGTB demonstrations, so on and so forth. But again, I show this map. What is Europe? This is Europe in 1534. And this Europe tells us what? Europe is a woman, Europe is beautiful, and Europe is organic. And that's first it. So my idea is, what does this map wants to show us? The map is from 1534. In the midst of the religious Luther Catholic Church. It comes, and the map is, there is a description under the map, which is called Res Publica Europea, which is replacing Res Publica Christiana in the moment where the Res Publica Christiana is splitting into Protestantism and Catholicism, The only thing I want to say is, it seems to me that there is something like a cultural resonance on this continent, which is beyond nations, which is beyond nation states. It's also a very sort of flip-sided notion. What is the nation state? In ancient times, we were all kingdoms. For instance, where I was born in Grevenbroich, it would have been in the kingdom of Limburg. So, there was no Dutch-German by that time, but there was, the Bishop von Limburg. So in the Catholic term, it was a Dutch-German thing. And then came the French Revolution. Then we started with nation-state making. We called our states republic, République Française, Repubblica d'Italiana, Republic Hungary, Bundesrepublik Deutschland, whatsoever. So, and in addition, we have many layers of cultural sort of developments, from Baroque to Gothic to Renaissance to Romantic, which we share. What I want to say is, if you travel from Ireland to Thessaloniki or from Helsinki to Lisbon, you see towns, you see marketplaces, you see architecture, which is different, obviously, from Amsterdam to, say, Salzburg, but you have features of what is particularly or specifically European. So there is a cultural resonance. And my only question, I do not need to have this. I'm not fighting for it. My question is only, or my hypothesis is, if Europe wants to survive and we want to be an entity in the 21st century, because the others don't care. There's an interesting book on the market, is The World Will Survive the Death of the West. Everybody will survive the death of Europe. Only Europe will not survive it. So for me, the question is, do we want to survive? And if so, what are we shaping as a political entity if we decide that we should shape a political entity based on the map I showed for the 21st century, so as to give Europe a role in a multipolar world? I would know what we have to offer in a multipolar world. Europe has two things to offer. We always were in war. So what we do know is from the Westphalian Peace, 1648, that we need equilibrium of power. I think the multipolar world needs an equilibrium of power, and I think Europe could be the resonance thing, sort of, what does Europe bring to the party of the multipolar world? We bring knowledge in equilibrium of power. Yeah, we bring also knowledge of diplomacy. We have never been an empire. Persia, today's Iran, India, China were all empires. So they are empire structures. Every country has its specific sort of, throughout centuries, what it stands for. Europe brings equilibrium of power, diplomacy, Westphalian peace, and some experience in diplomacy. I think that is some reflection. And then obviously we would need to think about what do we do as Europeans in the multipolar world. We can say we renounce. Let's do Chimerica. We are just little, whatever we are, 500 million people, not so many. Sure, we can. But I think there is a question that also cultures can die. We have seen the Egypts, we have seen the Mayas, the Incas. I mean, civilizations can die. And I would argue that Europe has a distinct civilization, which started off with Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. It's a 2,500 year civilization. We can say let it die, or we look at what we were, what we are, and our specifica of culture. And out of that, I know that it's not a today's discussion about LGTB and in one day we solve the problem. It's a generational project. But if we frame it that way, I think we could have a chance within, say, 25 years to build a new community, to have a new idea of who we are, to move ourselves out of that West, because we are distinctly different from the US. And so based on that sort of intellectual work, we have a concept of who we want to be, say, in 2049. Because 1949, the last world order was created. I think we are in the midst, that's my book Zeitenwende, yeah? We are in the midst of recreating a world order. And the question for Europe is, do we have a role? We can answer no, but if we answer yes, I think we need to have a timeline, some ideas, from scratch. And in that extent, the EU doesn't interest me any longer. I'm not dystopian. The EU for me is finished. Yeah. So the only thing that interests me is what is the picture of a Europe in 2049 that I can engage people for, motivate them emotionally, cognitively, intellectually, so that they have envy to live with me in that Europe. So I need to build it. Yeah. That is why I'm here, because I want at least to raise the question.
I think absolutely. I think the question is entirely legitimate, but in a way, I think it's an intractable question, and it's it's very difficult, really very difficult to answer. Well, it's definitely difficult to answer the question of what is Europe, because obviously, if you're going to ask what can Europe do, you have to ask the question that George put earlier: what is Europe? And if we go back to your map, Ulrike, 1534. It may well have been one of the first moments or one of the early moments when European states indeed started to use the word Europe. But we all know what was happening in Europe in 1534. Apart from the crisis of the Reformation, there was obviously the advance of Ottoman Turkey into Central Europe, the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, and then the Turks shortly thereafter at the gates of Vienna. And it's precisely in those moments of external pressure. There's also an anecdote that at the Battle of Poitiers in the late 8th century, that the word Europe was also used in some of the historical annals. At moments of great external pressure, then yes, European states begin to think in terms of Europe. But at other times, it's exceptionally difficult to think in terms of Europe as a political actor, not least because, as you've just said about the whatever it was, the Prince Bishopric of Limburg, we different Europeans have incredibly different national histories. Our statehoods are very different. I speak as an Englishman who lives in France. We have a completely different history of statehood from that of Germany or Poland or whatever, or even more so the countries of Eastern Europe. But there's another thing which I think makes the task exceptionally difficult, and that is that even when, for example, in the High Middle Ages, people did start to use the word Europe, or at least think of world unity. There's an excellent article by the great medievalist Kantorowicz about this. They never included the Eastern Orthodox. So the medieval dream of world unity, of the Republica Christiana, or Pax Christiana was always excluding the Eastern schismatics. And that's why I think that George mentioned the Bosnian War a moment ago. To me, that war was, independently of Germany's own particular role in it, was very, very emblematic of a constant theme, a centuries-old theme in European history, which is to regard which is a sort of progressivism ultimately, to regard the Western and central part of Europe as progressive, and the Eastern part of Europe, Russia and Greece and so on, the Armenians, as essentially backward. And the modern European project in its current form, unfortunately, is in many respects the continuation of this very, very, very deep-seated belief in the superiority of Western Europe over Eastern Europe.
I totally agree. I couldn't agree more. So that's again why I think that if we want to be reasonable or authentic or honest about whatever European unity, again, I'm not defending it. Yeah, if we answer we don't need that unity, then no. But then, Peter, then we will all be subordinated under EU pressure, authoritarian pressure. Yeah. So the real question is, if we don't have a alternative project, I think this EU sort of krake will just, get worse and worse, because we all see the NATOization of EU. I mean, there's a congruency now that NATO and EU becomes congruent. So there is a real danger about authoritarian structures. We all defend this. My only thing is, if we want to escape, we would need a different vision about who we are. It starts with culture. And I agree, John, we would need to think about the role of the church, about the, Constantinople, Byzance sort of thing. Yeah. Go back 1,000 years in European history. What happened in Constantinople, in Byzance with the schism? Can we overcome the schism? I'm told, I just traveled to Russia. I just was in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I think we need to overcome this very stupid split between the Orthodox and the Christian, and this pejoratism, this sort of downlooking to the Eastern countries. But this is cultural work. That is why I suggested initially here in this talk a European Russian youth sort of institution to get exchange. Because what what I'm saying here is not I will get tomorrow. Yeah, it's but if I plan that over a generation, I have young Europeans visiting the East and visiting Moscow and St. Petersburg, going to the palace of Katarina the Great, then something in their heads may work, And so there is this cultural youth exchange work, which would be the basement, the foundation of bringing the East and the West of the European traditions, including the church, together, and then perhaps we could have a common political project,
Keep in mind, where I live, we look at you guys as the schematics, okay? So, it works both ways. One of the things that I think about a lot, particularly with this new government in Germany, which really I find very, very disturbing, which is completely counter to everything that you want to see happen in Europe. Is Europe's fate, I'm not saying EU, but is Europe's fate going to be determined by Germany?
No. I mean, honestly, I wrote dozens of books, and my dream, if you want to, a word for my dream, I call it the European Republic. And it's basically that we go back to the regions like Tyrol, like Catalonia, like Bohemia, like Alsace, like Schlesien, and we make a very tiny roof with, not superstate EU, but a very tiny common roof called the European Republic. And below you have the old regions like, Crimea, Donbass, Luhansk. I mean, Europe is federal by its origins. Look at any given EU nation state today. Most of them have huge migrants, the whatever the Germans in Hungary or the Hungarians in Romania, the minority questions, go to Alsace and ask Alsace people, are you French or German? They answer you, I'm Alsace, and through the waves of history, for some part we were French, then German, then back to France, whatever. So I think we could have an intellectual work on what is the nation state. I prefer the terminus of republic, and I go to the ancient kingdoms like Saxonia or even Hohenzollern, Prussia, and you go there and you go to these identities and you think about how these identities, roughly 50, 55 little entities of 5 to 15 million people in Europe, yeah, how we could cluster them into a political project. That's what I want to think about, yeah. Perhaps it's fantasy, but as long as nobody has a different meta concept, it's perhaps not fantasy.
Could I just ask, do you see any signs anywhere in Europe of people, adopting your ideas and, moving towards this different Europe?
What means
Any
adopting
political
my ideas?
movements, any political figures? Somebody that you can associate. Yeah, I think this is an interesting project, and this could develop into something like that.
Well, I mean, you can blame me for it, but just a week ago, I had a talk with Björn Höcke, who is the most, ugly guy of Germany, yeah. And we had a talk, and the same talk, sort of the EU is crap and authoritarian. What do we do? And I said, I don't know what we do, but if we don't build ideas about what we should do instead, then we will go nowhere. I'm deeply convinced thoughts become words, become action, become reality. As long as we don't think where we want to be, we will be nowhere. So my intellectual work is just leave the EU aside. The thing is finished. I'm not spending my energy or wasting my energy on the EU. It's hard enough to avoid that it gets too authoritarian, but the emergency or the urgency to have other images in our minds, what should become instead, that is I think the task of the day. I'm not saying that I will win the discussion. I'm not saying that I will get my European Republic. I'm not saying that I will get it by force. That's not what I'm saying. At least what I can say is the book, I mean, I wrote that book 10 years ago in 2016. It has been translated into 8 languages, so there was some political interest in it. It's like, how is it? Steter Tropfen hüllt den Stein, steady drop erodes the stone. But that's why we do these discussions. Who has a better idea, has a better idea. The only thing I do not want to lose Europe in a more cultural or civilizatory sense. If I do not want to lose it, I need to think about how to constitute it politically. And it only can come from culture, self-recognition, and an intellectual reflection who we are, where we stand, and what we want. That's this, and all this beyond being part of the West and beyond the EU.
That's very good.
I'm in agreement with you. I just don't come across very many Europeans that talk like you anymore.
Yeah.
Anymore.
Well,
you've put it very well. You've put it very well. Beyond the West, I like that. Beyond the West, I think that's a very important. We all agree, of course. Beyond the European Union.
I give you a very interesting book. Hauke Ritz, who is my co-author of that book. Yeah, Hauke Ritz wrote a very, very good book, which is called "The Decline of the West and the Re-Emergence of Europe," and he does a very, very subtle. And it's going to be translated into Serbian. It's going to be translated into Italian. I hope he will have an English translation very soon. But
How about Russian? Russian also.
Russian, yes, Russian too. Russia, he has Serbo, Italian, and Serbian. Yeah, and what he does is he disentangles in terms of culture that Europe is not part of the West. Yeah, I mean, starting with Starbucks, we have Segafredo coffee, and it's much better than Starbucks. Yeah. Our cinema is not Blockbuster, is not Hollywood. We have Pasolini and Chabrol. And the moment we refined ourselves, I mean, the problem that Hauke analyzes is that we have been accustomed to think ourselves as part of the West. And if we stop thinking this because we detect that we have a distinctly cultural difference to the West, meaning the USA, not because I'm anti-American. I'm not anti-American. I'm anti-deep state America, but I'm not anti-American, right? I want a nice partnership with the US, but I'm culturally not the West because I have distinctly different economic traditions, because Europe is about the Republic. We have also, say, images of poverty. We have Franz von Assisi. We don't pray for money like the evangelics, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's so many distinctly different things, yeah? And the moment we could do some education, and the moment we could orient our youth, as I said, through a European Russian youth institution going east, I think there is a cultural understanding to create. And all this to say that over 25 years, we should just look to the Orient, look to the East, stop turning the head and twisting our neck that Europe looks too much to the US. And this is a cultural work over a decade or 2 decades, but I think it's doable if we start it. I'm naive, perhaps, but...
It's a wonderful project and a wonderful line of hope, let's put it that way. And I personally strongly agree with you. Ulrike Guérot, thank you so much for giving us your time. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to you, and I look forward to meeting you in person on Saturday.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you, Peter. Thank you, George. All the best. Bye-bye.